You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Shawn Wilkie, and along with my awesome co-host, we interview the innovators in this space every week. Ivan, this is a really interesting episode. Why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Sure is. I'm Ivan Zach, and I'm happy to introduce you, if he needs introduction, Dr. Ernie Ward and Beckie Mossor. We're going to talk about veterinary podcasts, and we're going to introduce both of them. So Dr. Ward is a Chief Veterinary Officer at the Wild Earth. He's Executive Director of Education at Vertical Vet. He's an owner of E3 Management Consulting Services, DVM from University of Georgia. He's Executive Board Member of the Rescue Animals Community Effort. He's on the advisory board of Gray Muzzle Organization. In 2018, he received an award of Veterinary Journalist of the Year. He's an author of 3 books tackling pet nutrition and clean eating, and obviously the co-host of the Veterinary Viewfinder Podcast. On a personal side of things, he is an avid pedal surfer and was a member of the Violets, an alternative rock group who had the top college song in Rolling Stones magazine in 1991. Cool. Beckie is a Chief Operating Officer and Veterinary Technician at Affordable Pet Labs. She's a Director of Feline Health and Educational Base Paws. She's a co-founder of Veterinary Advancements, Executive Director for Human Animal Bond Association, holds a bachelor degree in public and nonprofit administration from the University of North Carolina, Pembroke, and she is a co-host of Veterinary Viewfinder Podcast. This has been the hardest introduction I had over the last year. You guys have too many credentials. Thank you for coming to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks, and that'll do it for us tonight. That's all the time we have. We're so sorry to end the show this way.
Exactly.
Well, Ivan, that makes me tired hearing you say all that stuff. It's nice sometimes, when you hear these lists of what you've accomplished or done, but it just reminds you how old you've gotten.
Hey, wait a minute.
I'm speaking of myself. I'm speaking of
myself. You just
myself.
moved Beckie into that? I don't think that was fair. So, among all things, I mean, we're sort of amateur newbies with Shawn on our podcast. Tell us about how you kickstarted yours and how did you get to where you're at, where everybody knows about you.
Yeah, I guess I'll start off, Beckie. This was something that I had my very first podcast back around 2004. And at the time, podcasts weren't a thing, so it kind of went nowhere fast. But I did it for about a year, and I just addressed general pet health topics. But there wasn't like this big podcast push. Apple just sort of had this little thing that you could do and you could upload. There wasn't Spotify or, any of these other platforms. But I always believed, look, I came back from radio, I had recording career, in college and vet school. So I like audio. And so around 2005, I started to feel that podcasts were about to take off. They hadn't quite gotten to this inflection point that we see today, but I felt it. And there really weren't any vet podcasts out there. Our dear friend, Dr. Justine Lee, was doing a continuing education sort of recordings of lectures. And so we knew that it was headed in that direction. And so I reached out to a couple of colleagues of mine. And one of them was our original co-host. And then, that led me immediately to Beckie, who had known in the periphery. But honestly, the very first lunch we had to discuss this crazy idea down in Orlando, Beckie, you and I, the chemistry was just undeniable.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We had, conversation with Dr. Ernie is not hard, as most people know. But, when you have energy and passion and enthusiasm in the same place, it's a really easy connection. And, I was at a point in my career where it was sort of yes to everything because I was exploring all these amazing opportunities.
That's so awesome, guys. And Beckie, I felt the same chemistry that Dr. Ward describes when we had you on the show last time. It was kind of like an immediate kind of conversation. There was a lot of really interesting flow. And where I want to take the conversation next is a kind of an interesting place. Me and Ivan started this because we love the veterinary industry and we wanted to see more innovation. We wanted to see, all of these kind of companies kind of have a place to go. And we didn't see COVID happening. None of us did. But man, I'm so happy that we started this podcasting journey, when we did. because it allows me and Ivan every week to connect with cool people like you guys and have interesting conversations. And I feel like I have a social network, even though it may be in the car on the side of the road where I'm recording this podcast, or in my home office that's changed about 5-6 times so far, including Ivan's house, which is great, Ivan. Thanks for the loan of your house. But what's it been like for you guys with COVID and continuing your podcast? Do you feel the same way that I do?
Yeah, I think that in general, Dr. Ernie and I, we just recorded our 200th podcast the other day. So we've been at this now 4 years, just about. It'll be 4 years in November, I guess. And what I've found, and Dr. Ernie, I think you'd agree, is that over these last couple years, people really feel like they know you. They feel like they're having a conversation with you on a weekly basis. It's very personal and organic, and it is very raw truth from Dr. Ernie and I on all these topics. So I do think that there is a sense of social feeling, especially from our listeners that are like, oh, I know these folks and I have a listening relationship with them. So, and I'm honored for that. I don't know, Dr. Ernie, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the Viewfinder community has grown. We've had over 100 guests. So, we've sort of had this entire social network that either we've brought our friends into, and which has given us a deeper, respect and relationship, or new friends. And so for us, that was a really important part. But then at the same time, Beckie and I were setting out to tackle the toughest topics in veterinary medicine. And so obviously when COVID hit, that despite our attempts at trying to somehow sidestep the obvious, we kept coming back to COVID. And I think that especially, Beckie, some of those early February, March, April episodes where we really got down to nitty gritty. I mean, we were talking about you guys are going to have to transition to curbside service before that was really a thing. And we were trying desperately to connect with best practices and sort of create these social networks of support because we knew, wow, vets were going to get hammered on this one. And so, COVID definitely in some ways accelerated the podcast, but in other ways it really proved challenging to us because, how do you maintain positivity and enthusiasm and offer solutions every week when it feels like the world's falling apart?
Yeah, isn't that the truth? It was really it's been such a crazy journey for us as well. We did the same thing. We put together a group of our friends early on and did this kind of, what can we as technologists help veterinary practitioners kind of take advantage of that we know about that they may not know about as tech community members. And so we had a lot of fun with that podcast. And I remember we streamed it live on YouTube. I think at one point we had 300 people like listening to it live. And there was just this thirst for knowledge. But now it's kind of like we're in this area where COVID is normalized. It's just kind of what we do. We wear masks, we kind of do this thing. And it's, to some degree, it feels like, at least for me, and I don't know, Ivan, you've got an interesting experience kind of living through COVID on both sides of the ocean. But for me, it feels like COVID's kind of normalized and it's, you kind of wear your mask, you do your thing, but I'm totally used to working remotely now. Ivan, I'm going to get you in here. What's it been like for you with COVID, over in the Ukraine, having a baby, coming back to Nova Scotia? Do you feel like a big difference between the two worlds, or is it pretty much the same?
No, I think it's just the same for every country now. And as you said, it's just a part of normal right now. The traveling is a struggle, and I like how everybody virtualized and how everything that I've been doing for the last probably 8+ years remotely and building the companies remotely, it's just normal for everybody. For me, it wasn't much of a transition. But speaking of COVID, I got this cold right now. We have only, I think, 4 cases in the city where I live. It's like super low numbers. And I have this cold, so now I run not to like pharmacy, I run to test for COVID. So that's probably the difference, which I've done actually yesterday. So hopefully I'm not going to come down with it. But I wanted to kind of slightly switch the topic to maybe facilitate those that are interested in what is the podcast, how to run it, and what to do with it. Ernie, when you said about the being at the sort of beginning of the podcast era, I immediately thought about this thought of the first person with a fax machine, where there's no anybody else on the other end. You just don't know what's going to happen. You're just sending one-way messages. And how does that feel that it's picking up? You mentioned that, and I'm very interested in that because we started the podcast and it feels the same way. We meet great people. It's super interesting. We met over 60, I think, by now, and it's kind of enhancing the circle and the network But do you feel the sort of, how does the audience grow? Because I don't. Like, we just do it every week religiously, and we see the metrics. It's interesting, but I don't have that feeling that I have like this audience. So I don't know if you have something like that, or do you have, because you don't go to conferences anymore, so people don't tell you,
Right.
hey, I'm listening to your podcast.
Yeah, I feel the same way, Ivan. We don't track those metrics as closely as we should. And then recently, we had Gene O'Neill, who's the new CEO of the North American veterinary community, on the show. And one of his administrative assistants sent us a note saying, the last time Gene was on your show last year, we did a market report and it reached 2.2 million people. And we're like, what? So we know that we know from our downloads that it's, tens of thousands of downloads every month. So we're super happy. But you're right. The first year that we did it, it was a bit like yelling down a well. I mean, it's like there's nobody down there and we're just yelling. And then after about a year, Beckie, we started seeing traction. And I think, honestly, it was a trust, right? I think that at some point the audience starts to say, wow, these guys keep coming back, and they're kind of entertaining at times, and we did learn a little something here. And maybe that was a little edgy conversation. But Beckie, I think it was the audience trust that then started generating word of mouth referrals, because after that first year, we started hockey sticking.
Yeah, it was a learning curve, right? And a bell curve, one would hope, but a learning curve all the same. And at the same time, too, like Dr. Ernie said in the beginning, podcasts were pretty new at that point. So it was like you had this really devoted group of listeners right from the beginning who were looking for veterinary podcasts because they were early adopters. I have to say, and I hope it doesn't sound vain, I really don't. One of my favorite things over the years has been when you see these veterinary groups asking, what are you listening to? What podcasts do you suggest? Looking for veterinary podcasts. We would pop up in those suggestions like all the time. And that made me feel really, really good. And I have to say, for me, it's personally been, I love it because this isn't about really getting to know my face or getting to know my brand. It's really been my opinions, my thoughts, my true values as a technician. And I don't know that really clearly answers your question, but it's what I wanted to say.
But it sounded good.
It's what I wanted to say because
really good. Yeah,
I established this with a very simple premise, was to tackle the toughest topics in veterinary medicine. And I think that freedom and liberty that Beckie and I are trying to share with our audience, it's like, we will say the things that maybe make us uncomfortable as a profession. We are critical of our organizations, right? I mean, I think, Beckie, for us, because you're right, like, our face, I mean, it's not like we're really promoting the heck out of this thing. We feel like it's an important part of this conversation. And if we can spark change, if we can somehow be a catalyst for others, then I think we've served our purpose.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So you mentioned one thing, I think that's sort of a golden nugget to take for those that are starting the podcast or thinking about starting the podcast. Any initiative like this, in the past, you wouldn't just, come up with your own radio show. Like, that would be a huge lift. But now, just like with the startups and all the availability of online resources, servers, and everything else, podcast is something that anybody can start. So if there are people that are interested, that are listening to this, I think it would be super valuable just maybe give tips of what did you do. I heard the first one, which was we religiously showed up. So that's the very important one. You set the cadence, you have the format. What other things you could suggest to someone that wants to start a podcast?
Yeah, I definitely, I was fortunate because I had an extensive experience in recording already. So I knew my way around the mic, as we say. And so I think that gave me a leg up on others because I listened to some podcasts and quite frankly, they're unlistenable. Like, the quality of the audio is so poor. Beckie knows what a nut I am about this.
That's us.
But but the reality is, you really first learn the craft. Like, I would say if you have a great idea, then go out and learn the craft. So there are certain settings, recording equipment. There's just, a kit that you need to probably have. And you're right, Ivan, it's gotten a lot more accessible. Having said that, I think it's a bit like, film and music. The more accessible things become, there's great opportunities for breakthrough acts that you have never heard or been exposed to otherwise. But then there's also a lot of chaff that you have to sort of wade your way through, a lot of noise. So learn your craft for sure. I think that certainly consistency. I mean, Beckie, you know, I mean, I've not missed a podcast
No.
ever, and I feel obligated. Like at this point, Beckie and I feel a responsibility to our audience, and there are times like we try to drop our podcast first thing on Wednesday mornings, but there have been times due to travel or other constraints that it comes out at at noon or whatever. But golly, Beckie, we've never gone much later than that.
No. Yeah, and you really have. I have missed a few, but I mean, I would say even through hurricanes, I want to give you credit there that like even through hurricanes we have managed to put up episodes.
Oh yeah, it's been remarkable.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's funny, Ivan. I've got a few tips that I got when we had kicked off this whole thing. So, one tip that someone had given me was to record 10 episodes before you launch anything. And that was such a great tip because we learned so much in those first early episodes. I remember we had Dr. Justine Lee on the show, who's a personal friend of Ivan's and now mine. And she was schooling us, in the middle of the podcast. She's like, okay, we're going to re-record that. I was like, whoa, you can do that? And me and Ivan were both, at that time we weren't looking at each other because we didn't use Squadcast back then. So we were just like getting this education by our guests because we had no idea what we were doing. But by doing those first 10 episodes, we were really able to kind of figure out our groove and how we work together and what it looks like. And so that was one of the best learnings that we had. And Ernie, to build on your one about kind of know your craft, I would say either know your craft or hire somebody that knows the craft.
Right.
And so we've got a producer, and we're so lucky. For me and Ivan, we literally show up. We've got a great team that does our marketing. So we show up, we record the episodes, and we have fun with it. And I think for me, that's why I'm still doing it, because every week when we sit down to do this, I have fun with it. And so we get to do the fun bits. And I'm sure you enjoy the producing and post-production. I don't know how to do it. So I just enjoy the speaking. That's what I show up and do, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is funny, Shawn, when I hear people say that. And by learning the craft, that is your 10, recording the 10 or practice episodes. I agree with that. I just, for me, it's sort of like my exploration of music, art, writing, all those things. It's like, I really want people to know how to hold a brush. I really want people to know the chords on the guitar. I really want them to understand scales and modes. And I think that sometimes in life, deep knowledge in an area is really helpful. It doesn't mean that you have to engage in the practice of that deep knowledge, but I do, I'd like to talk to you guys about EQ settings, right? I mean, because I think that understanding of how sound is transmitted and then retransmitted and then listened to, that's really helpful for me. But look, I'm a nerd, so that's that.
Hey, so I've got a question. Beckie, what are some of your favorite episodes? You guys have 200 under your belt. So where should our listeners go if they want to listen to some of your guys' best content?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's like asking somebody which is their favorite child, Shawn.
Yeah, you know what? It's so true. I think I could pretty easily look to the service dog conversation that we had because it's a real strong emotional point for me. And so I was able to do what I felt like was a lot of really great education on that episode. Boy, we've had some really amazing guests that have been really great to listen to. Wow.
It's tough, Shawn. I mean,
Dr. Ernie.
yeah, I know. It's like, so what of all the songs you've written, what's your favorite one? What book is your
How
best?
could we pick?
It's hard to do that. But there are some standout episodes. I mean, a highlight for me was having my dear friend, the Pulitzer nominated best-selling author, Steven Kotler. He was really gracious. He had his first book of fiction in a long time. And Steven and I go way back. And so we were, part of that little press tour. He did a great job. I think that probably blew most of our audience's mind, Beckie. I think they probably were not expecting what they heard, because we went off into the stratosphere, but it was a lot of fun with Margie Shirk, another Canadian up there. We had a great time with her talking about declawing and our stance against declawing several times. So, yeah, but at the end of the day, what I really think the truth answer that I would give is when you say, what's your favorite episode? It's the one I just recorded.
That's awesome. So what's different between episode 100 and episode, the next episode? What have you guys learned along the way that you think has made you adjust or kind of improve the podcast? This is a selfish question for me and Ivan, actually.
Yeah, well, compression and EQ, I think I'm better at that, Beckie. But that's not what you want to hear. I think, Beckie and I have really gelled. Like,
Yeah.
Beckie, it's like we just sort of read each other's mind now.
Yeah, I think the experience is everything. And I will say, to answer your question before, now that I've had a second to resonate on it, way back in the beginning, I mean, I'm talking within the first 10, 20 episodes, we had a Valentine's Day episode our spouses were on.
Yeah,
and it was a super fun episode because everyone was possibly under the influence of a little bit of evening cocktails. And so you get a whole lot of truth. And then for Mother's Day that same year, we had our moms on.
yeah.
And that was actually a really cool episode. Sometimes my favorites are the ones where we get really personal because it does connect with our audience. And so having my mom and my husband as guests were probably actually my two favorites, even though it was very vulnerable.
Yeah, those were good episodes. You're right.
I think that that question, what is your favorite podcast? I think the worst question that could be only, what's your least favorite podcast? And name the person who sucked the most. That would be terrible.
Hey,
Those
this
I
is
could
right
probably
up
think
there,
of
so
faster.
So there's also, we have this question that sometimes people ask us. They say, how do you monetize the podcast? Like, how do you do that? And again, for some people that are starting it, we don't have an answer to that. And I think that you said that you alluded to that this is not the, something that you do for a living. We certainly never thought about doing that. And I think that we're doing it for fun. But is there a strategy behind it that people can adopt? I don't know if there is one. We never thought about this. So
yeah, Ivan, we struggle with this because we don't monetize it. I mean, we've had a few one-offs, sponsorships of episodes here and there by the generosity of people within the industry, but we really haven't promoted in that sense. I'll tell you one of the reasons why, and I want to get Beckie's perspective because she has a very valuable one as well. But for me, there came this next wave of podcasts after us, and they seem to be capitalizing on a trend, and they seem to be selling stuff and sign up for this, and it felt corrupted somehow to me. It just didn't feel as pure and authentic. And so, Beckie, look, I have strong feelings about this. If I could figure it out, Ivan, where I didn't feel like I was somehow selling my soul. And look, this goes back to my artistic days and even my writing. I mean, it's like, I really haven't figured out a good way to make money doing much in my life. I do follow things that I'm very passionate about, and I've been very fortunate, don't get me wrong, but nothing, I just could never go, hey, and this week, if you sign up $10.99 for a special insider's backstage pass with me and Beckie.
That would be good.
I couldn't do it.
Yeah, it's funny because you want to monetize it because your time and energy and effort, and certainly money has gone into the creation of the podcast. But then there's also an element of, I guess, kind of selling. Like, we have a lot more liberty in what we say by not being sponsored and to not kind of fall into that monetization. We're able to stay really organic and say what we want and represent what we want. In our own personal brand on the podcast.
Yeah. Having said that, if you're a large veterinary pharmaceutical company
We'll say
out
what
there
you want
and you're looking for a
enough
way to
money.
reach thousands of colleagues,
Same time.
contact me, Dr. Ernie Ward at Gmail.
Yeah. And I also want to say too that I think if you're trying to get into this for the monetization, you're probably in it for the wrong reasons. Yeah. There are ways to do it if you have the ability to make this a full-time job and to really work the social media aspects of this, you might. But I think if that's what you're in it for, you're in it for the wrong reasons. We were really in it to tackle the toughest topics.
Yeah. And Ivan, what has really, I guess, disappointed me a little bit, like you'll see these new things, and it can be YouTube, it can be, TikTok, it can be, podcast, and sort of out of the gate, it's like there's a price for admission. And I've never understood this. Sort of like, you got to earn your value a little bit out there. I think that, and I think we have, so I think that we certainly demonstrate that, but, our intent, as Beckie said, was not, we didn't set out to go, hey, how can we make some extra cash on the side? We actually said, how can we tackle the toughest topics that might benefit our colleagues?
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I think that's sort of the angle that we took. Well, first, I was out of job. And I just wanted to explore the world. Like that was our take on this. And then Shawn was at the beginning of his startup, and then I started a couple more things after that. And then, I think that the payback is really you're doing what you want to do, you're doing what you like to do, and then if you attract more audience, they might look at your craft if you're doing something else. So I think that my advice, if anybody would care, would be if you have something else you're doing, then have a podcast to establish yourself as a thought leader in certain areas and invite people smarter than yourself, which is very easy for Shawn to do. We do it all the time.
I don't even know where to
You don't have to come back to that. Yeah, it's a goal of mine, at least 1 or 2 insults per show for Shawn. So it worked like magic until now it's only one.
I just want to mention, let's not make that a format we adopt, Dr. Ernie.
Yeah,
That's not gonna fly.
Well, you guys leave that alone. That's ours.
Which
can have it.
actually, we didn't tell you this, guys, but before every episode, we say that, usually I say that I'll give it a $25.
I'll give you $100 gift card, but we forgot.
Yeah, if you insult Ivan or Shawn during the show, we actually say that to the guests. That's
hilarious.
We're not in it for the money. We made that clear.
Yeah.
How much for the gift cards?
There you go. Well, the time is up, guys. It's been too fast. I think it's been running faster than usual. We always ask 2 questions, and you guys can split who takes which question. So the one question is there anything that you've seen, listened, watched, recently read that inspired you that you would like to share? And the second question is who else you would suggest us inviting to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast? So who wants to take the first one?
I'd like for you to invite Tim Ferriss. So I think that's an easy
so
ask.
Let me just, how do you spell it? Tim,
yeah,
Tim?
Like a Ferris wheel. Yeah, so if you could do that. No, I'll take the first there. Obviously, I read a lot. I probably read too much from time to time, but I will go back to one of my favorite guests, just a book that I think everybody should read, which is why we had him on our podcast, Steven Kotler's Stealing Fire. It was nominated for a Pulitzer. It'll blow your mind, and I don't mean that just metaphorically. But, Steven has been a student of flow state for many, many years. I've learned a lot of the techniques that I employ on a daily basis directly from my relationship with Steven. And I just encourage everybody to explore how can you achieve an optimal state of consciousness. And, look, people that have listened to me lecture for the past couple of years know I talk a lot about the adaptive subconsciousness versus consciousness, prefrontal cortex versus amygdala, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, I'm learning and doing and practicing these things so that I can stay, as creative and vibrant and energetic as possible. I mean, I'm in my mid 50s, and I still feel super primed for life, physically, emotionally, and intellectually. And so I think learning from people like Steven, and we're basically the same age, we're all, what we've done, I think there's our generation X, I think we look to the boomers and the greatest generation before them. And what I did in my 30s, and Steven did the same in his life and his experiences, was we found the older people that were successful and vibrant and energetic in their 60s. And so when we were in our 30s, I would go up to these people after Ironman races and say, tell me what you're doing, right? Because I, in my 30s, wanted to capture that. And Steven's book, Stealing Fire, really goes into some of the cutting edge science and medicine behind optimal flow states, creativity, just how can we achieve this next level, of humanity, if you will. So I recommend that to anybody. That's that, Beckie. Sorry.
That's amazing.
Okay, so I think if I were to make some recommendations to you, I probably would stick in my client lane, and that is that I work with 2 really cool organizations in the pet space that I think you would love to talk to. One of those is BasePaw's CEO Anna Sakaya. They are actually doing cat DNA sequencing, and they're recognizing health markers, and they're just changing the face of how we can really get in front of knowing our cats, identifying cat health markers and long, healthy lives. And then the other would be Affordable Pet Labs, and they're an organization that is really frontiering in-home lab collection services for pets and really changing the approach to affordability and the pet experience to get a better patient outcome. And that's my personal vet tech values. So those are 2 organizations I really support, and I think you would love conversations with them.
Thank
you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinaryinnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.